that would last only 1 or 2 days. So I'm more interested here in outlining what I take it to be the central issue, which is the accusation that Marx had about Hegel, that Hegel, unfortunately, was an idealist, and that Marx transformed him into a realist. So here we are. This is just to give us a look. This is a picture of Hegel. Hegel in 1829. This is a picture sketched one afternoon at the Mendelssohn household. That Felix Mendelssohn's sister Fanny had married an artist, Delphine Hensel, who went around sketching everyone. Heinrich Heine was there that day. Hegel was there that day. Edward Gans was here that day. And you might say history was knocking on the door of the Mendelssohn household as they all sat down to listen to a new string quartet by the teenage Wunderkind of German music, Felix Mendelssohn, who was also Hegel's student at the time. Marx claimed, of course famously, he said, "I found Hegel standing on his head and I put him on his feet." Now, of course, what counts as upside down and what counts as right side up depends on what attitude you're looking at. It could have been that Marx was upside down, Hegel was right side up, and Marx tried to turn both of them upside down. A cartoon of Hegel, Marx rebuilding philosophy on top of Hegel's head, with Hegel looking rather sad. This is a cartoon, by the way, from the mid-1970s, from the New York Review of Books here. Now, what I want to argue very simply is that Hegel was right and Marx was wrong. That, in fact, you should stay an idealist and not become a materialist, as Marx said. Now, first, what was it that Marx found attractive in Hegel? What kinds of things did he and Hegel share in common? Well, at least 2 things, both of which I'm going to contest. Both he and Hegel thought that we could speak of entire forms of life. Hegel uses 2 different German terms for this. He sometimes calls it a Lebensform. That was the term also that Wittgenstein used. He also uses the term Gestalt des Lebens, which really means the same thing. This is a particularly Hegelian use. That there are entire forms of life that periodically from time to time break down. This is a key element of the Western experience of history. It is the experience of the loss of antiquity. That once there was a form of life, ancient Greece, with its own religion, its art, and so on, and it broke down. It broke down, it's gone, it's vanished. Nobody worships Apollo or Zeus anymore. And it got replaced by something else, Rome, which then fell apart and broke down. Turned out not to have worked. And then this was subsequently followed by the Catholic Middle Ages, which broke down, didn't work. So there's a fundamental experience of what, let me use the term, of what happens when a form of life becomes uninhabitable. That is, when the people living in that form of life can no longer see themselves in it. They cannot live out, cannot inhabit those positions. In particular, what Hegel thought was that a form of life becomes uninhabitable when the giving and asking for reasons in a form of life, when the reasons you give people for what you're doing, the reasons you demand from them about what they are doing, when those very reasons seem to become unreasonable, such that that whole activity of giving and asking for reasons suddenly becomes alienating, suddenly ceases to make any sense. Now, Hegel thought this out an entire path of history, showing how certain activities, certain social practices of giving and asking for reasons, particularly political, artistic, religious, and philosophical reasons, would break down. And when that breaks down, what happens is that people find themselves in a new situation that's different from the old one. Metaphorically speaking, Greeks found they could no longer really be Greeks. Metaphorically speaking, it is as if the Greeks suddenly were saying things like, we do this because the gods have commanded it. Not a single one of us believes anymore in those gods or that they ever issued those commands. But this is the reason we still give for why we are doing things. Now Marx said, I say, somewhat convincing. Look, the problem here, that really is the problem with Hegel. Hegel is an idealist. Hegel thinks that what we should look at is the reasons people give each other. Now, it's just idealist obfuscation here, right? That is, Marx's answer was, again, something that rings a bell as one of the examples of what Paul Ricoeur right, was later to call the hermeneutics of suspicion. That when people are giving reasons to you, they're not really giving reasons. They're giving you something else. That reasons always occur within a particular class and economic background. And that in particular, Marx thought that the kinds of reasons we are giving each other in this modern capitalist world, in fact, are unreasonable. Look, capitalism, first question, why was Marx so anxious? Why was Marx so determined, right, to overthrow capitalism? What was wrong with capitalism, according to Marx? Well, really, there were three things he thought were wrong. First, capitalism poses as a system of freedom, but in fact it's a system of abject servitude. The worker is in servitude to the needs of capital, although in fact the whole rhetoric, whole ideology, the activity of giving and asking for reasons all revolves around freedom. So it's a system of servitude that calls itself freedom. Second, it's a system of exploitation. The entire system, Marx thought, is based on the exploitation, of course, everyone, you've heard this, the exploitation of the workers, right, by the bourgeoisie. As the old Soviet joke used to have it, right, that, capitalism was the exploitation of man by man, but in communism it's the reverse. Here. Marx thought, no, there would actually be a way of eliminating exploitation. What was wrong with exploitation? Well, exploitation has four components to itself, Marx thought were wrong. First, you take a vulnerable population, paradigm case, children. You use them in child labor. You use them for something, to produce products at a cheap price. You harm them in doing so, and you benefit yourself. You exploit someone, not merely when you harm them, but when they are vulnerable, you use them, you harm them, and you profit from it yourself. A system based on exploitation, he thought, was simply irrational, unsustainable. So it's a system of servitude that pretends to be freedom. It's a system that is based on, right, a morally objectionable practice. And third, as Marx famously said, it creates its own grave diggers. It will ultimately destroy itself. It will create an uninhabitable situation. So Marx, looking at this Western experience of history, of course, said we're at a moment, he thought, that Hegel has not fully understood. We're at another moment of one of these classic breakdowns. And we begin to see this, of course, in everyday life. And what will happen here? Now, what will happen, of course, is that the productive powers of capitalism will grow, right? And that, well, first there'll be a stage of socialism and then of communism. What is so good about communism? Now, note, one of the things that Marx doesn't say, and I'll come back to this with Hegel, Marx thought, in fact, explicitly held in two different places, that there was nothing unjust about capitalism. Now, if you look at those three things here, that seems striking. This is a system of servitude, a system of exploitation that creates its own grave diggers, and there's nothing unjust about it. There's nothing unjust, Marx thought, because every form of life, every economic system creates its own rules of justice. In the capitalist system, it's right for the workers to demand more. It's good, it's perfectly right for the employers not to give it to them. There's just nothing unjust about this. Rather, communism is supposed to be a place where something else occurs. And again, Marx admittedly left it fairly unclear, but there were at least three aspects, supposedly, to what was going to be better in communism. First, there would be a lack of external control. That is, people would be able to direct their lives without being controlled by something, now I'm going to speak very vaguely, outside of themselves. I'm going to leave it vaguely like that because I'm going to come back to what that inside-outside bit might mean. Second, not only will they not be controlled from something outside themselves, society will operate as a kind of spontaneous harmony. There will be lots of different individuals. There will be lots of different personalities, lots of different talents, but these talents supposedly now will spontaneously coordinate with each other. And again, a very attractive picture. There are many out there, you can give lots of examples of, say, being at a group where people spontaneously coordinate with each other, let's say, to help clean up something on the street. Everybody just takes part. Nobody has to give anybody orders. Everybody's just paying attention to the other person. And everybody feels free, lack of external control. Nobody's ordering you around, and there's a spontaneous harmony. that's established. And thus, only in communism will each person be able to be said to follow his or her own law. Once again, and piece of spontaneous harmony. Let's say you're with a group of people, you suddenly decide to throw a party. Everybody brings some people bring the drinks, some people bring the food, some other person brings the music. Everybody has a great time. Everybody helps the whole group clean up afterwards, and it's terrific. And at the end of it, everybody was, as we used to say in the 60s, doing their own thing here. Yet everybody was nonetheless cooperating with everybody else here. Now, this was not supposed to be a system of idealism. This was a system of materialism because it was based on a theory of productive powers and so on. Now, Hegel, what I want to say is, look, on this view, as I've outlined, it's pretty clear that what Marx thinks is that Hegel got some big parts of the picture right, but remained an idealist. Hegel didn't understand that really what's at stake are the productive economic powers of society, the social forces that are driving this kind of activity of giving and asking for reasons. Hegel was an idealist, of course, right? And this is captured most famously in one of the most often quoted lines in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's great breakthrough work that he wrote in 1807. Hegel always told his students that he considered the phenomenology to be his, quote, voyage of discovery, his Entdeckungsreise. This is where he really thought things out for the first time. It's an astonishing book if you've read it. It's a first draft. It's written in less than a year. It's written by a man at the very kind of bottom of life at this point. He's lost his job. He has no prospects for the future. Germany's falling apart, right? War with Napoleon is imminent, so on. There's just no good outlook for him. So he writes the Phenomenology of Spirit. Very good one. The truth is to be comprehended, he said, not merely as substance, but also equally as subject. And I put up a picture I simply found on the internet. This is a complete historical fabrication. This is supposedly Hegel tipping his hat to Napoleon, who you'll notice, by the way, notices it's Hegel. Hi, Hegel. This never happened. But in any event, there's the substance becoming subject in 1807, because as we know, Hegel claimed he was writing the very end of his preface. So he was writing these lines as Napoleon's army was defeating the Prussian army in Jena, practically outside of Hegel's bedroom window. And he did later say that he saw Napoleon going by, and he said, I saw the world spirit on horseback. And this has often been quoted as if he didn't mean that, somewhat ironically here. So the truth is to be comprehended as substance, not merely as substance, but also equally as subject. No, not merely as substance. Not that the truth is not to be comprehended materially, but also equally as subject here. The truth, and in other places he says, the truth is the whole. Das Wahres, das Ganze. What is the whole? Now, you might think, of course, that the whole to be grasped here would be ourselves as natural, producing economic creatures working within the natural order here. That nature, really, our natural constituents, our natural components here, should be the things that will be determining this. And that ultimately a theory which located us in nature would be the theory that would best grasp what it meant to be a substance and perhaps also equally a subject. But what is now nature as a whole here? Hegel holds a doctrine that I call, somewhat whimsically, a disenchanted Aristotelian naturalism. I was looking around for a picture to illustrate this, and I couldn't find anything better. This is a cartouche outside the house in Bamberg where Hegel actually finished up doing all the proofs for the Phenomenology of Spirit, where he was living with a friend. So a small crawfish, a Flusskrebs, as they call them in German here. And this, for nothing else than its whimsicality here, I decided to put it as a symbol of Hegel's disenchanted Aristotelian naturalism. What does this phrase mean? Look, one of the things that Hegel said, just again to outline the views as opposed to giving a full argument for them, is that we must understand that we can no longer believe in nature as an overall teleological whole. To understand something teleologically, this is going to be very important for his theory of history. To understand something teleologically is to understand something as aiming for a purpose and doing something in order to satisfy that purpose. Now, if I was asked to explain, say, why you went to the store yesterday, and if the answer is in order to buy some bread, that would be a teleological explanation. You did this because you were aiming at that, and you did this in order to do this. Nature, as a whole, does no such thing. Nature, as a whole, aims at nothing. Nature does not mean anything. This is what we have learned from Galileo and Newton and modern chemistry. And although Hegel was writing too soon, we have finally learned this also from modern biology. Now let's call this a disenchanted nature. The term disenchanted, of course, comes not from Hegel but from Max Weber. This is the term Max Weber later used. That is, we can no longer think of nature as being animated by a purpose. So if we are looking for orientation, we cannot look to nature. I say looking for orientation. This is, of course, a term taken from Kant. Kant's essay, What Does It Mean to Be Oriented in Thought, gave one of the, I think, the best descriptions of philosophy that's probably ever been given. Kant says, remember, when we find ourselves in a very dark room with no light, we seek orientation. So what do we do? We look for a familiar landmark. So the room, all the light goes out. I feel the desk. Okay? If I know if the desk is here, then the wall should be over there, and the door should be to the right, and there it is. I look for orientation by finding familiar landmarks in the dark. The problem is that when we leave the realm of experience and we ask what things are like as a whole, we ask what the world is like as a whole, we are, metaphorically, in the dark. There's nothing to hold on to. When we leave experience behind and we ask, are we free or are we determined, for example? It's hard to get. What philosophy does is, in this darkness of pure reason, is start looking for handholds, something to orient us here. Now, for several thousand years, Europeans have thought that nature provided such an orientation. That if we just learn to act naturally, think of, say, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if we just learn to act naturally, we would be better. That this nature would guide us. We have to learn to trust our instincts. But this supposes that there is a place for us in nature to be guided by. If nature has no aim, if nature means nothing, then nature cannot orient us. Now, to call this a disenchanted nature, therefore, might seem to suggest that, therefore, since nature has no overall purpose, there are no purposes in nature. False. In fact, actually Aristotle, not the moderns, Aristotle was right on this. Aristotle was wrong on one other thing, but he was right on this. There are purposes in nature. That is, for every organic living form, there is something for that animal or plant that can be good or bad for it. Something that can be good or bad for it. I have a slide on this. Just leave it that way. Good or bad for it. How so? Well, the key example here would be the concept of disease. So you have to ask yourself the question, is disease a reality? Or is disease only a way that we human beings happen to describe things? Now, an animal is diseased when it is being interfered in its proper functioning by some internal state of itself, generally caused by some other organism or infection or something going wrong. And something has gone wrong. A purpose such as procreating, or a purpose such as eating, or fleeing from a predator is being interfered with by virtue of this. As Hegel says, a stone or a rock cannot become sick. An animal or a plant can. This is to say that there are things that can be good or bad for animals. Now, what's good or bad for an animal is really reducible more or less to a couple of things, which is not getting eaten by something else, and reproducing and recreating the species for animals here. But nonetheless, there are, so Hegel thinks, purposes in nature. The difference between animals and humans is twofold. The animal, he says, has a purpose before it. Say, get food, right? I'm hungry, I must eat. Animal has a purpose, but it doesn't know its purpose as a purpose. It's, can't sign a second each step, as Hegel says in the German. Doesn't know its purpose as a purpose. Human beings know their purposes as purposes. They know them for the goal. They know a goal to be a goal. Now, to the extent, let me make a large leap here. To the extent that there are purposes in nature, there are reasons in nature. There is a reason for the spider to eat the fly. There is a reason for the fly to try and avoid being eaten by the spider. Neither the spider nor the fly understands that reason as a reason. Neither the spider nor the fly can make an inference, can use this as a basis for making, say, a judgment. Oh my gosh, I'm in a spider's net. I'm in very deep trouble. I've got to beat my wings really furiously and get out of here. Right? Oh my gosh, it's getting closer. I had better struggle more here. None of these things can know these reasons as reasons, although there are now reasons in nature. But to use another great metaphor, Hegel says these reasons are asleep, right, metaphorically. They're not there actively as reasons. Now, although there are purposes and reasons in nature, this doesn't follow that nature itself is rational. That is, again, nature as a whole doesn't add up to anything. It's just a bunch of events going on. So there is a kind of limited meaning, a limited, to use a current buzzword in philosophy, a limited normativity at work in nature that doesn't cohere with itself. And one of the ways to look at this is to say that nature cannot organize itself into any better or worse way of being. It doesn't make any sense even to say of nature, can't you be a little better as a whole? Yeah. So there are purposes in nature, but nature has no purpose. There is a normativity at work in our natural material life, but this is not enough to orient us. So, question, what does it really mean to act from a reason, to understand a reason as a reason here? Now, to understand a reason as a reason, this is, for those of you who have worked in the metaphysics and philosophy of action, here, I will just indicate something very generally because I don't want to go into it in a whole lot of detail, although we can return to it in questions if you like. In the current debate about the philosophy of action, here, it is often said that what causes a person to act is their mental state, what's going on in their mind. So this is a naturally suggestive idea. For example, I feel hungry, therefore I am caused to go look for food. Or I feel angry, so I'm caused to yell at you. Or I want the room to cool down, so I open the window here. Now, that makes it look as if, therefore, to have a reason is to have some mental state that is now causing some muscular activity in the world, some inner event causing an outer event. This is, of course, the wrong way to look at it, Hegel says, because the causal relation, and here I'll give you not so much Hegel's extended argument, but a kind of intuitive, natural language argument. This causal relation holds between a substance and its action. When the lion leaps on the gazelle, we say that it is the lion that leaped, not the lion's mental state that leaped. If I punch you in the nose, you say, Terry punched me in the nose, not Terry's mental state did this. Now there's lots of explanations. Psychologists, physiologists may want to explain all this. There's no doubt a biophysical explanation of things going on here, resulting in things happening here. But that is not the nature of an action. An action has to do with how a substance expresses itself in the world. Intentions and actions aren't two things that are causally related. Intentions and actions are two sides of the same coin. Once again, a quasi-Aristotelian idea. Let me just give you a slogan. To have an intention to do something is merely to have an action that is on the way to being realized. If I intend to go to Italy in June, all this means is that the action of going to Italy is now in the process of being realized. I'm buying tickets, looking at itineraries. An action is merely an intention that has been realized. The meanings of intentions and actions can be determined apart from each other, distinguishable, not separable, and so on. Now, if this is the case then, right, what I want to argue is that, look, what causes an action? Reasons move people only when attached to what I'm going to call their second nature, and then there's two other moves to get to Hegel's theory of freedom here. The relation of action, the agent to action, is the relation of a substance, a material being to action. To say that the lion leaps on the gazelle is to say that there's a material being, a lion, and it jumps onto the gazelle, grabs it. Okay, there's nothing idealist about this. This is something that happens in the natural world here. Agents, however, human agents, have something that distinguishes them from all the other forms of life. And that has to do with what Hegel calls, again, using Aristotle's term, second nature. Our first nature is the nature we are born with. These days, under the influence of computer technology, at least in English, we say it's the nature we are wired to have. As if we're kind of computer chips being held together by some copper wire and so on here. By the way, notice how different technologies affect the way different philosophers and people often talk of things. In the days when all people had was a few writing instruments, Locke said the mind was a blank slate. People began later talking about it as if we were clockwork, right? And these days, we think we're computers here. That's either metaphors. What is a second nature? A second nature is something you acquire in addition to the nature with which you are born, or what you're wired to. For example, habits, dispositions, various attitudes, so on. So just think habits, dispositions, acquired traits, etc. These form an aspect of second nature. But this second nature can become an object to itself. It can become an object to itself only because we also now become not merely substances in having this second nature, we also become subjects. That is, we occupy a position in social space. Now, to be a subject, as opposed to merely being a substance, is to be able not merely to have a second nature and have it as an object of itself, but also to be able to make normative judgments. To be able to say that something is correct or incorrect, appropriate or inappropriate, true or false, right or wrong, moral, immoral, ethical, unethical. Okay, all these involve this element of ought with it. By virtue of assuming a position in social space, we now acquire a whole bunch of inferential moves we can make. Now, by an inferential move, I mean something like the following. Well, many inferential moves are quite obvious. For example, if something is red, then I know that it's not green, because to be red is to be exclusive of green and vice versa. But I also learn a number of other inferences, such as, you have no right to talk to me like that. Or, well, but this is the way I am supposed to respond to people like you. Or, what gave you the authority to tell me what to do here? All these are inferences. That is, you have a spot, and you now know what inferences you may validly make to other kinds of things. It's the kind of question, one of the first questions that small children ask their parents. So why do I have to do what you tell me to do here? And of course, because I'm your mom, I'm your dad, and I get to tell you. Oh, yeah, well, thank you for pointing that out. Here. But this making of inferences in social space gives us this reflective detachment now from things. That is, we acquire not merely a second nature, but a capacity to evaluate that second nature according to social norms. Appropriate, inappropriate, correct, incorrect, right, wrong, true, false. Here. And by virtue of being able to evaluate our second nature, and by having our second nature be an object of itself, we now are able to reshape that second nature. Now, the second nature, by the way, when we begin to think about it, is not merely our own habits and dispositions, but also the entire social world around us. the various institutions and practices that encourage certain types of actions, promote certain types of habits, right? Discourage other kinds of habits, etc. So in changing our second nature, often we don't merely work on ourselves, we also work collectively on the institutions that we have in the world. One of the reasons for banning the practice of dueling here is that, like this, libertarians, people who really believe that the state should not regulate anything, often like to characterize dueling as allowing adults to shoot at each other with live ammunition for sport. Here. And they say, why should people be prohibited from doing that? And the answer really is because given human nature, there would be a lot of us who would end up accepting duels, although it's better that nobody be allowed to do so at all. So we know in advance that this is an institution that will in fact encourage destructive behavior. If we ban the institution, make it socially unacceptable, frown on people who do so, then eventually this practice will die out and people will find other destructive things to do. Here. Now, because of this kind of social nature, we can reshape our second nature, though it's very hard to do. It is, after all, nature. Nature doesn't move very easily according to our wishes or whims and so on. It's hard to change ourselves. And what we have to do is develop new reflective practices. Now, here are two conditions Hegel thinks have to be met. Sorry, because I'm an Apple user and this is a PC here. So, it's one of these great contradictions of the modern world here. What causes an agent to act? Hegel thinks that there's always a cause of your action. What causes you to act is your nature, your second nature. If I ask, why did you do this? It's because of what you are. When what causes you to act makes sense to you. Now, this is a weasel word here. I'm leaving this purposely vague at the moment. When that makes sense to you, you are, as Hegel puts it, at one with yourself. So you're doing this, so you might be, say, sweeping up the floor after dinner, let's say. And I say, why are you sweeping the floor? I always sweep the floor. Why? Because I'm sweeping. Why would you be doing this? Well, because it seems, I'm not hurting anybody, listen. You are at one with yourself. You don't feel that there's anything at all odd or inappropriate or normatively wrong about what you're doing. Now, when you can have a reflective capacity to understand what you're doing and to give it as a reason, you're not merely at one with yourself. Hegel's term for this in German is bei sich sein. You're not merely at one with yourself. You are free. And I would put this down as the same when you are the cause of your own cause. Here's a sidelight, right? There's a long debate in the free will literature about whether or not we are free or determined, or whether or not the two are compatible or incompatible. And Kant saw, very quickly, right? Most of you know this. Kant saw that it seemed to be the case if that were the only two alternatives, freedom or determinism, then the only way we could be free would be if we were somehow standing above the causal order and giving orders down to the entire causal order, so that we initiated causal events that were not themselves the product, where this initiation was not itself another causal event. There's these odd events that just happen out of time, of course, and they just intervene directly in the causal order and shape things. This is the only way out of this concept. And Hegel, again, at the end of book 2 of his Science of Logic, more or less said, well, actually, here's a third alternative, which is what's called reciprocal causation. So that is, we are an intricate, self-reflective, self-monitoring system that is operating on itself. And we are the cause of our own causes when our second nature, our character that is operating on us, is a character that makes sense to us, for which we can give reflectively good reasons. On this, Hegel agreed with Aristotle, your character is your destiny. But you, of course, can change your character. And to a limited extent, you can therefore change your destiny. This is a denial of a radical Augustinian view. It is an affirmation of a more ancient Aristotelian view about the relation between freedom and destiny. Now, if that's true here, I mean, it looks as if this so-called idealist proposal, which emphasizes that substance should become subject, and therefore ultimately the explanatory priority of all this normative stuff, in fact has got a very good understanding of the material basis of action. That if the charge is Hegel's an idealist, he only thinks the only thing that's real are thoughts, whereas I'm Marx, I'm a materialist, a naturalist, I think the only thing that's real are material events. And this just shows that Marx actually hasn't understood Hegel, and probably didn't understand his Aristotle as well as he thought he did. Okay, now, what is the whole within which we orient ourselves? Now, what is the whole? What is this if it's not going to be nature? Here. If it's not going to be nature, it's going to have to be something else. And, of course, one of the things that Marx proposed is that it had to be history. History forms a large whole. History forms a whole which now has a kind of internal drive to itself. It is aiming for a certain conclusion. And if we learn to orient ourselves within that, it's as if, once again in the darkness, we can grab onto this, right? Find the wall, go along the wall, because we know this is the way out, find the door, open the door, and then of course we step into life here. Now, this is often said to be the role that Hegel, in fact, right, ascribed to history. Now, of course, by now you can fairly well guess where this argument is going. Look, one of the things that's quite clear about history for Hegel is that history, like nature, is not aiming at anything. This does not mean that history has no purpose. History, there was never anything in history, say, called the world spirit, which had a goal. It was headed for that goal, and sometime around 1789, in the French Revolution, it realized it. It took a few more years for it to understand what it had done, 1807, after Hegel wrote his Phenomenology. But then history had succeeded and kind of, congratulated itself, and everything's been fine since then. This, of course, isn't Hegel's view. Look, there never was, on this view, there couldn't have been a large subject, right, like in history. It was aiming at anything. It was rather a series of human forms of life, which broke down for reasons that at the time those people could not understand themselves. There was a series of successors to those forms of life that first consisted of the people who just found themselves in this chaotic situation where the old rules had broken down and weren't sure where. They knew that they had to go somewhere, and they started going in this direction. And then finally, after the French Revolution and the proclamation of the rights of man, according to Hegel, we now have a way of philosophically comprehending what meaning that history may have had. And of course the meaning is that when we look back now at empirical history, now Hegel is making both a philosophical and an empirical claim. He is claiming that when we look at the history of the world, we will see that among all the other changes that have gone on, there's huge amounts of changes in technology, eating, culture, everything else. There's at least a large philosophical question that has always been raised, which is the one that Aristotle raises in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics. And it's the question of who has the right to rule. Plato raises this in the Republic also, obviously. Not who does rule. That's an empirical political science question. Who has the right to rule? Who has the right to create the law that other people must follow? And Hegel says there really, as it turns out, when you look at history, it turns out there were three and only three alternatives. Either one person, say the emperor, the pharaoh, one person has a right to set the law, and everybody else must follow. Or a group of people, some, set the law, aristocrats, let's say, male aristocrats, set the law, and other people follow it. Or all of us set the law, and we all equally contribute to following. Now, this is Hegel's famous shorthand he would give his students. He would say history has a progression. One is free, some are free, all are free. Here, right? Those are the only three possibilities. One, some, all. The empirical study of history, he says, actually shows us that something like this is the case, and this begins to give us now an answer to Kant's question. Kant asked, who could be the author of the moral law for oneself? who could tell you the right and wrong thing to do except for you yourself? You must therefore be a self-authorizing being. But there are no self-authorizing beings. First of all, it's a logical contradiction because even as Kant himself came to see, if the only way you can be subject to a law is to impose it on yourself, then you have to ask whether it's rational for you to have imposed that law on yourself. And you can't appeal to that law and to show it, so you need another law ad infinitum here. So there can be nothing like this. Kant, in his critique of practical reason, realizing that this was a paradox, said this is just the fact of reason, Faktum der Vernunft. We can't get around it. We just find ourselves both under the law and as studying the law. But Kant used the same phrase that he shared, actually, he took from Rousseau. He said, in the true moral world, we'd have a kingdom of ends where each would be both sovereign and subject. In the ideal world, each of us would be in a situation where I give you all the rules. I tell this group what to do. But at the same time, every single member of this group is telling me what to do. Now, there's a back and forth, a kind of give and take about this, and what Hegel thinks happened in the French Revolution was something of monumental importance that had first been announced by this, insignificant man, carpenter from Nazareth, Jesus, a couple of thousand years beforehand. Jesus had said, everyone is equal in the eyes of God. The rights of man said, that's true, and actually we can make everyone equal. Not in the sense that everyone will have equal powers, or that there will be no differences of wealth, but that every person is now entitled to an equal dignity, an equal treatment of decency, that we are all now cooperating in this kind of way of thinking about things. So history has a purpose in the sense that we can understand now that, not that history was aiming at anything, but that given that we have ended up in this case, and now if we make the arguments, tricky enough, we can understand why we are suddenly in a position to evaluate this for what it is, and to understand this as now having been rationally required by us, so that really we are in the situation that although we are far from achieving it practically, we are at the situation where we now know that the Declaration of Human Rights is in fact the rights of man, is in fact the truth about us. That there is no person who by birth, nature, has the right to rule automatically over other people. Here. Now, he calls this by the German term Aufhebung. Here. German term Aufhebung. Often translated in English as sublation because there is no English word for Aufhebung. So the translators, basically they made a word up. They found a word in English that hasn't been used since about 1500. And they said, close enough. All right. When Hegel talks about Aufhebung, by the way, when you read almost all literature on Hegel, it says that the word means three things, right, in German. Right? Aufhebung means both to negate something, cancel it out, as if your life insurance policy is canceled, it is aufgehoben. It means to preserve something, as you might say, would you save a place for me at the concert? Would you aufheben a place for me? And of course, it also means, for those of you who know German, right, to lift up, eben auf. So you'll see in the Hegel literature, it always says, Hegel uses this term in three senses: cancel, preserve, and to raise up. And this is given, you might say, a lot of ammunition, it's given a lot of support to everyone who wants to say that really the Hegelian system is an idealist system, as Marx said it was. You have these things at the bottom, and then they get aufgehoben, sublated, and say swallowed in something larger, and then swallowed in something larger, and then larger, and higher, and raised up until finally you reach absolute spirit, and everything's contained in it. And this is a very dangerous view of totality. It is the spirit of totality that informed Marx. It is probably the most dangerous, although maybe logically consequential, arguments in all of modern philosophy. In the two places where Hegel discusses his use of Aufhebung, in the Science of Logic and in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, he says explicitly, I meant to put this in as a quote in my presentation here, but I somehow wrote that. Explicitly, Aufhebung, he says, only has two meanings for me: negate and preserve. Forget about the raising up. Never mentions this. Never, doesn't mention it very much. Never mentions it. It is not a raising up. It is, in fact, a canceling and a preserving. here's a metaphorical way of thinking. Instead of thinking of this process as going upwards, think of it as going from side to side, horizontally rather than vertically. That's a metaphor, but nonetheless, to aufheben something is to circumscribe its authority. Something is aufgehoben, sublated in Hegel, when the authority it has over you or it has over someone else is canceled, circumscribed, limited, by moving to a new context here, where you're not exactly denying the old thing, but you're now limiting it in a certain way, so you're both canceling it and preserving it. So, for example, Hegel says I have a right to private property, but this gives aufgehoben immorality. It's not that I lose all my property in morality, it's that, no, it turns out I can't do anything with it I want to, particularly if it leads, to violent harming of another person and so on. So it's preserved, canceled, but preserved at the same time. In fact, it's a wonderful metaphor here. Now, what history has shown us from one is free to some are free or all are free is really a process of vast changes in social authority. This is what philosophically we learn from history. There are many other things to learn from history. This is the philosophical lesson here. And that the great mistake, of course, is to think, as Hegel thinks, to think that we should conclude, therefore, too much from this. Why? Well, part of this has to do with this use of aufhebung as a way of handling philosophical problems. Let's go back to orientation in the dark. Kant thinks, remember, when we find ourselves in complete darkness, we look for landmarks. When we leave the realm of ordinary experience and we ask ourselves, what is the world like as a whole? As the classical questions of metaphysics and of life, right? What is my place in the larger order of things? What happens is that when we detach ourselves from experience like this, we quickly find ourselves engaged in various antinomies, as Kant called it, that is, basic contradictions. Freedom versus determinism. Does the world have a beginning in time? Does it have no ending in time? Is the world infinitely divisible, or is it only divisible down to certain parts? Right? That we find these really basic contradictions. And Kant called this, dialectic. Hegel called it the same thing. What we learn in dialectic is that we don't abolish these contradictions. We tame the threat to reason that they seem to hold by putting them into their proper context. And in particular, Hegel thought that in the modern world, we find that there are, basically for us to be the kinds of modern people that we have come to be, or in general, to have become the kind of individuals that we have become over the long process of world history. To become individuals, self-originating sources of claims, we're going to have to presuppose that there are certain rights that we have vis-a-vis each other, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, not in the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That there will be various philosophical contradictions in those rights. Locke says those rights are all relative to the act of a sovereign. Hobbes says those are all relative to the act of a sovereign. Locke says they are all natural and preceding the act of sovereignty. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We will subscribe to the doctrine of rights, even though these philosophical answers will not be ultimately answered. These philosophical problems will not be ultimately answerable. Likewise, for us to have these rights, we will require a certain moral conception of ourselves as able to act impartially. There'll be problems with that. Downing problems versus consequential problems. For us to be these moral individuals who also ascribe to having these rights is for us to be now committed to very particularistic types of claims in family, civil society, and the constitutional state. But as Hegel says over and over again to his students in his lectures, there is no final solution to be found to these problems in any state at all that is possible in human history. Every state itself is limited, finite. It's merely one state among many. It cannot provide a basis for the ultimate satisfaction in life. You will not get your orientation completely by your membership in any state at any time, anywhere. In fact, the great philosophical temptation from the Greeks up to the present has been the idea that there might be a final overarching whole within which we could orient ourselves in life. This is the danger, Hegel thinks, in this. The only time we ever saw a picture of that, he said, was in ancient Greece. The Greeks thought the world was a purposive organic whole. They thought that in their society that if everyone simply followed out their social position in life and did their own duty, that this would spontaneously organize itself, spontaneously harmonize with itself. What the Greeks found, tragically, this was what their tragedies were really about, was that that wasn't possible. That this dream of a spontaneous harmony, which can occur in little things like parties and so on, that all of our social and political life could be organized around this kind of spontaneous harmony, this is possible, is what he thinks is the great animating delusion of modern times. And in fact, his philosophy is intended to be a kind of inoculation against these kinds of things. Here. Now, if there is no self-restoring, self-harmonizing organic unity in nature, and no self-harmonizing organic unity in history, and no self-harmonizing organic unity in social and political life, then there's no law guiding that can be orientating for us. There's lots of orientations we can find, but as Hegel says in his 1820 Philosophy of Right in the preface, he says, philosophy always arrives too late on the scene to give the world any instruction on where to go. The owl of Minerva only spreads its wings and flies when the sun is going down, flies at dusk. Here. We can be oriented, but ultimately the kind of totality that philosophy gives us, which is a totality in thought, as we stand back now and we ask ourselves, how do we justify all these things? What sense does all of this make? And how do we put all this together into a coherent philosophical system that we can achieve a kind of wholeness and totality in thought, but never in practice? And in particular, any organic view of the state would just be a disaster. What was Hegel's alternative, by the way? Well, once again, Hegel said, everything good and rational about this has already been written by Aristotle. All we need to do is learn how to figure out, to retranslate this into terms acceptable for the modern world. As Aristotle, so he puts this here, this is the point of view of right. Individuals have the right to administer their own resources, and so on. I've had this up for a while. I'll come back to this in just a second here. The quote from Aristotle says, the best society is one run by a society of equals, that is, of the middle class. The worst thing that can happen to a society is that you have vast gaps in wealth. Why? Because the rich think everything is purchasable. Die Reichen denken, dass alle käuflich ist. They think they can buy their way out of anything, so they feel no social obligation. The poor have no stake in society, so they feel no social obligation. Such a society is always on the brink of falling apart. In fact, what we should aim for, he says, is the decent society. Right? A society, not a classless society, a middle-class society. Not a society where everyone has the same, but a society where there's no great gaps between the poor and the wealthy. This was, of course, the original left Hegelian alternative, taken up by Edward Gans, and then later Heinrich Heine. Edward Gans was Marx's teacher. Apparently Marx didn't listen to that part of the lecture very, very well. So there are, of course, problems with this world. We could go into them. Hegel thinks that first there's a problem. The world might become too prosaic. There is this point of view of right that individuals should have the right to administer their own resources and so on. This is the democratic principle that you should share in the government of local communities, corporations, and guilds. One of the greatest ills that can befall a state, and it's the class of officials, the bureaucrats. They become remote and alien. This is Hegel speaking. And by its skills and education and use of official authority may provide a channel for the arbitrary will and the oppression of its citizenry. There's a danger at stake now in this new, modern, rational, bureaucratic state, which ought to be this kind of middle-class state, right, with no great gaps in wealth. And he says, in fact, the kind of jargon that bureaucratic officials, he's thinking particularly of Prussian officials here, says citizens learn to regard their, quote, bureaucratic language as a kind of underworld jargon, like some kind of thieves' slang. Sounds familiar? If, in fact, the state were to go so far as actually to require identity papers from everyone and require their picture, such that you would have to produce your identity papers to the police upon request, Hegel tells his students, right, the state would then truly become a vessel of galley slaves, where everyone is supposed to always be exercising oversight over everybody else. And there is a danger, he thinks, in our modern, over-administered world here, that this could become a reality. So it's not all rosy and so on with Hegel here. But basically the argument is, conclusion, should Marx have been a Hegelian? If Marx had learned the lesson about organic totality and not thought that idealism simply was the substitution of thought for reality, but had taken some of these other ideas seriously, I think Marx would have realized he should have been a Hegelian. In fact, it was this myth of spontaneous harmony, the great idealized view that this was the golden age of ancient Greece, and that we just get that restored again here. Something impossible within this modern world of individuals, the dream of somehow now not sublating these oppositions, not the Aufhebung of them, but the overcoming of them here would be, of course, the dream. And we will never overcome all these contradictions. Most pragmatically speaking, the most we can learn to do is balance them. We should never confuse politics with metaphysics. We should never think, on the other hand, that we're at the end of philosophy or the end of metaphysics. As Kant said in the very last part of the Critique of Pure Reason, after having spent 700 pages trying to demonstrate that philosophical metaphysics was an impossible enterprise and was bound to fail, it's actually rather striking. After the last 2 pages of the book, Kant says, "So, shall we give up doing metaphysics?" He says, no, we'll always come back to metaphysics like to an old lover after a quarrel, right? Knowing that we can't do without each other. Well, that's more or less, I think, what you might say the Hegelian view is. In that respect, he shares this with Kant. Should Marx have been Hegelian? Of course he should. That's Hegel at his various stages, as a 19-year-old student at Tübingen, and a 31-year-old man in Jena, and a 60-year-old man in Berlin. Thank you very much for your attention. The account that Marx gives of this as consisting entirely in the aggregation and enlarging of productive forces really is just not going to make sense of empirical history. So part of the lectures on philosophy of history, where Hegel goes into a lot of detail about Roman and Greek life and life in the Middle Ages, was to say that there are large changes in certain kinds of cultural ideas, particularly ideas having to do with individuality and so on, that have at best a marginal relation to some of the material transformations going on. And that's a real historiographical dispute with Marx, that this particular things cannot be explained very well by this so-called idea of this, productive relations of production coming into contradiction with the forces of production. Has there been progress in history? There's been progress at least in one major area that's of philosophical interest, which is the area of social authority. And that's the one is free, some are free, all are free. That's progress in history, although nobody was ever aiming at that. Caesar didn't bring the republic to an end and re-establish an empire so that people in the Middle Ages, right, could begin to create free towns. There is no teleology in that sense in history. See, teleology in the strict sense is some agent aiming for something and doing something in order to do that. In that sense, Hegel is a non-teleological thinker. There is nothing in history that's aiming at that. Even modern Europe is not aiming at that. Modern Europe, prior to the French Revolution, even though that's where it ended up.
Just briefly to answer that.
Yeah, but there are some problems with this, by the way. One of the questions is, why isn't Hegel, say, just a historical relativist? Why isn't this just a celebration of a particular historical period over another? This is an objection that Richard Rorty used to give to this type of thing. He would say, all you're doing is celebrating yourself. Right? What you're doing is you're saying, yay me, we're here. We look at everybody else and we say, you're not us, right? Look how backward you are. Now, so you need a larger account, which I tried to give in some other work, as to why Hegel is not a historical relativist. That is, how it is that the various demands of reason that have come to be made have been made by virtue of the very determinate failures that past attempts have tried to make of this, such that we now find ourselves in a position whereby we can now look back and see that in fact there is no other choice about the authority of reason except for reason to be its own tribunal. More concretely put, you can say that there have been alternatives. Various artists have claimed that it is art and art alone that sets the law. Shelley said, the poet, the Romantic English poet Shelley said, the poet is the lawgiver of mankind. Wagner thought that, basically in staging something like, say, Parsifal, he was actually creating a new religion, right? The new religion of the future for us to subscribe to. That, in fact, we have good arguments now for saying that reason can make sense of things in a way that, say, art cannot, and that therefore philosophy, that is secular reason, claims authority over art, so it doesn't claim to replace art, let's say.
Thanks. Stefan, you.
You gave a very interesting interpretation of Hegel, and I wanted to ask you, why do you give so a great importance as a concept of nature? That I found that very original as interpretation, because as you know, the concept of nature plays a little role in Hegel's thought. For example, in Hegel's Jugendschriften, in the writing of its use, the main point is the spirit, perhaps. In all the cases, the religious background of Hegel's philosophy, about you don't spoke so much. And why this comparison you made with Aristotle? Of course, Hegel said from himself he was in a kind of Aristotle, but of course not, and I agree with you, not in the sense he didn't take from Aristotle his naturalistic point of view. More his idealistic philosophy, because Aristotle has also an idealistic philosophy. He speaks also about the spirit. That would be my question. Why nature? Why this problematic of nature? Because from the very beginning, Hegel speaks, as you said, about history. That is his main problem from the very beginning, because that is the answer he gave to Kant, because he has another idea from freedom. And it is right that history has no aim, but the human history as such has perhaps not aim, but the history of the spirit has an aim. And this aim is the freedom. And man has to participate at the history of the spirit. And I would like also to ask you, would you agree to say, then when we speak from the history in a Hegelian sense, we should speak about the history of the divine spirit? And this is perhaps the reason for, in a Hegelian point of view, Hegel is right and not Marx, because, of course, for Marx, the divine spirit has no sense. He has another choice to speak only from the human history. But that is, as you said very well, the idealistic background of the Hegelian philosophy. He moves himself in this not teleological, but theological problematic as a Christian philosopher. Would you agree with that? And for this reason, of course, that is my objection. Perhaps I'm not sure that for Hegel, what we say when we are the causes of our causes were free. I wonder if that it's not more a Kantian definition of freedom. Because for Hegel, we are not causes of our causes, because God, the Spirit, is a true cause, and we have to participate to understand the causes who are already here. We are not the causes of our causes. The causes are given, and the finite subject has to become infinite, has to become God, by understanding the causes, not by producing them. We don't produce the causes. We are not the causes of our causes, because we are from the very beginning in the world, as you said, and that is in the spirit. Thank you.
This is a rather weighty set of questions. Look, let me just mention a couple of things first, just as background. When you talk about the Jugendschriften, it depends on how Jugend, of course, the Schriften you're talking about. And the first piece, okay, the Frankfurt things have very little to do with nature, a lot to do with human love, some to do with Hegel, the spirit of Christianity and so on that's written in the very end of the Frankfurt period. Part of this depends on how you look at Hegel's development. The Frankfurt period ends around 1799 because he shows up in 1801 in Jena by finagling an invitation from Schelling, breaking with his great friend Harold and so on. One of the things that happens in the writings from 1800, for those of you who forget the date, the Phenomenology is published in 1807. It's written in 1806 and published in 1807. It's actually being published as it's being written. For those of you who don't know the story, Hegel has promised, the publisher won't give Hegel the money for the book until at least half of it's been written. And Hegel keeps saying, well, this is half. And he says, the publisher says, I'm not sure about this. And Hegel says, well, hold on, I'll write some more. Says, okay, that's half. Right? And it just goes on and on and on, right? So the writings from 1801 onwards are thick with philosophy of nature. There's the 1801 system, the 1803 system, the 1804 system, the 1806 system, all of which are about philosophy of nature. In fact, the lectures that Hegel is giving, the last public lectures that he gives, which is now called the Jena System 3, or Jena System 4, excuse me, that he gives in 1806, as he's writing the Phenomenology, the largest part of that series of lectures is on philosophy of nature. So it's quite clear that at least in this development period, Hegel is obsessed with the philosophy of nature. Now, second thing is to look at the books that Hegel published in his lifetime, the Phenomenology, the Logic, and the Philosophy of God. Here. The encyclopedia, the middle group, has 3 volumes. The Philosophy of Nature is volume 2. It's larger than volume 1 and as large as volume 3, the Philosophy of Spirit. So just in terms of sheer size, right, the Philosophy of Nature is as large as the philosophy of spirit. So yes, I don't think
as you know, nature, it's only the non-spirit, it's the negation of the spirit. Hegel says that at the end of the Logics.
Yes.
First you have the idea and...
But volume 2 is Die Naturphilosophie.
Exactly, but volume 2, it's not the fundamental, it's not at the beginning, it's not at the end.
Hegel also says, remember, at the end of the system, right, that we could have done it in any order we wanted. We could have had it nature, spirit, logic. We could have had it logic, spirit, nature. We could have had it spirit, and so on.
I don't agree.
Well, but he does say that. Yes. And so, just in terms of, physical facts, in terms of size, right, the philosophy of nature is as large as the other things. So he's at least blathering about it, talking about it as much as other things. And he does say that we could. In fact, the original Jena Systems starts out as nature, spirit, and then something else. And then he decides, no, the ordering is all wrong. That's when he finally comes to the view that logic should come first. This also, by the way, for those of you who are Hegel scholars, Hegel didn't figure this out and left us no clear indications, because when he writes the Phenomenology, he seems to have reversed himself. Originally, he promises and announces and puts an advertisement in the journal that says, next spring I will be publishing my system, starting with the philosophy of nature and then concluding with the philosophy of spirit. And he never does that. Instead, we get something else called the Phenomenology, which is part 1 of the system of science. Part 2 became the science of logic. Then he said, no, part 1 isn't part 1 anymore. Part 2 is now, But the deeper question, you say, is actually how much volume 2 takes up, and however much Hegel been obsessed with it, the real philosophical core of Hegel's system is the philosophy of spirit here. And what does that have to do with Aristotle and things like this? Well, one of the features of this has to do with let me see if I can back up on this. One of the features that has to do with Hegel's continual reappropriation of Aristotle. There's lots of biographical detail for this. And in fact, this was actually, I think, fairly well known in Germany. When Karl Friedrich Bachmann does his review of the phenomenology after the book appears in 1807, famously he concludes, he says, "We have seen the modern Plato and Schelling. Germany now has its Aristotle," right, which is Hegel. It's the German Aristotle. Hegel didn't dispute that. When one of Hegel's sharpest critics later on, Adolf Trendelenburg, one of the very, very sharp critics of Hegel, who actually was a student of Hegel's in Berlin, when he did his dissertation with Hegel, Hegel made a point of congratulating him on this, even though it disagreed with Hegel's views so much, precisely because Trendelenburg had written on Aristotle. Hegel said that more people should be writing on Aristotle. This is good. I'm glad to see young people are, turning to Aristotle in this. And then in the beginning of the philosophy of politics, Hegel, in the Encyclopedia, Hegel says, the best that's ever been written on this is Aristotle, and most we can do is come back to this. At the beginning of the philosophy of subjective spirit, the best thing that's ever been written on mind is from Aristotle, we should come back to this. When he's writing the logic, right, what we really have to do is recapitulate many of the categories of the Aristotelian. So it's clear that Hegel is very, very indebted to Aristotle, just as a textual matter. Now, the real issue, and this has been the most divisive issue in Hegel scholarship since Hegel's own day, is exactly what the role of divine spirit is supposed to be. And right from the outset, there were two schools, with the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians on this issue. Hegel himself always finessed it. Now, one of the things that Hegel says about the divine spirit, he says, in the Phenomenology in 1807, he said that the feature of the divine, what makes the spirit divine, is that it has fully manifested itself to us. There are no longer any mysteries. That is, as Aristotle and the Greeks had supposed, the world as a whole is intelligible to us.
And it's as history.
Yes, it is intelligible. Now this goes against, say, someone like Kant. Kant's much more, in this respect, if you think of it, Kant's much more 21st century than Hegel is in this respect. Kant says the world as a whole is not intelligible. It's contradictory, it's what it is an sich in itself, is unknown and unknowable to us. We will never know. We can practically hope, we can make all kinds of rational postulates, but it is unintelligible. It makes no sense to us. Hegel says the world as a whole is intelligible. The world as a whole being intelligible, he says, is all that we could mean by divine spirit here. So what we mean is that there is a kind of reason at work in the world. Right? See, Hegel is, in this respect, Hegel is adheres to this kind of Johannine Hegel, right? That in the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God, and God was the Logos, and the Logos became flesh. All this means is that in the beginning was the Logos, that the world is intelligible to human reason. And at this point in history, we have now reached the point where this has become apparent to us. Now, this was at Hegel's own funeral. One of his students, Friedrich Förster, actually maintained this view, this graveside speech. And Friedrich von Heinecke, the other person who was head of theology in Berlin, said, no, actually, Förster just told you wrong. Actually, Hegel's an Orthodox Christian, so on and so on, right? And so, standing over the grave were already the two schools of thought that were dividing themselves over exactly what the meaning of this Hegelian legacy is. It would almost certainly take us too far afield, I think, to try and resolve all that. Although I would just, say, look, this argument's been around a long time. I think there are all the Hegelian texts stacked up to show that Hegel was actually a left Hegelian and not the right Hegelian that von Heinecke made him out to be. Let me put it like this: when Hegel's own wife, Marie, read the lectures on the philosophy of religion after they were published after his death, she said she was shocked. She said, because she said, I'm a devout Christian. This cannot be the man I was living with all these years saying these things here. So there's, historical reasons, lots of other textual reasons, I think, and so on. But this is the big division. Now, on the more orthodox traditional reading of Hegel, Hegel is a kind of Neoplatonist, not a Neo-Aristotelian. That is, there's a kind of divine essence. We participate in it. and we participate in it fully, then we are at one with the divine essence, and therefore we're free. So, if we are the cause of our own causes in the sense of reciprocal causation, that would be one thing. But as you say, be the cause of our own causes would mean that God is the true cause for Hegel. But on Hegel's own view, that would mean, therefore, we are not free. We would be in the position of the equals.
We are free by understanding the causes.
No, we're free, but we would not be free if there was something else other than our own reflective understanding. Right? So, you know, in the beginning of the phenomenology, you have the master-slave dialectic, right? Where one person, the master, is now setting the rules for the slave. And Hegel says, when this breaks down because it's first of all contradictory, because the master has to tell the slave that I'm the master, you're the slave, and you have no authority, I am your master because you recognize me as master, but you have no authority to do so. Here. Right? So the slave, by virtue of being a slave, the slave has no authority to recognize the master, but the master can't have the authority unless the slave does recognize the authority. See, it's a little bit like my saying, you know, I demand that you tell me I'm the most intelligent person in the world. And you say, okay, you are. And I say, well, what would you know? You know, it wouldn't count, right? So you're denying the authority on which the recognition is based. What succeeds that in the phenomenology, Hegel says, is a period where the whole world is now slaves to one master, a divine master. And that, he says, fails. It breaks down into stoicism and skepticism and the unhappy consciousness, despair. What Kierkegaard later called despair. So I think even in that passage of the phenomenology, you would see that Hegel at least is rejecting that kind of Neoplatonist understanding. But now, say a lot turns on whether you see him as the German Aristotle or as the German Plato. I think the position you just described to Hegel actually is Schelling's position. Yeah, and that, you know, that's the Schelling. Schelling recognized this early on. When Hegel sent him a copy of the Phenomenology, Schelling replied very icily, right, to this. You know, he said, I don't like this at all. Right.
Come in, please. Thank you. We have more questions.
My first question, let's say, I was not very sure I understood what was the role of Marx in the presentation. In what sense do you present it like something went wrong towards, like a student who didn't really understand his professor, or he didn't get the lesson, he failed the exam in a way? If this is what you're saying, then it always leaves open the possibility that other students should have get it, or if Marx could have get it, a next student really didn't get it.
Yeah.
Produce the same kind of misunderstandings in your perspective. So why Marx itself is a noun and pronoun of a particular person is relevant for your presentation. And second, a bit more complicated in my own mind is this idea of second nature. Second nature which manages to reshape itself and which creates a difference between humans and animals and humans. It reminds me about the theory of autonomy, and also like Harry Frankfurt, who was speaking about second order or higher order preferences about first order preferences, which makes a difference between an autonomous person and just a person who is indifferent about his first impulsions, let's say, things that move him. Such as, for instance, a smoker who's basically uninterested and indifferent about the fact of smoking, and a smoker who might continue not smoking, but in any way produce the second order preferences about his first order preference to smoke. So he acknowledges it might be wrong, but at the same time that it's too strong for him, so he doesn't want to give up because it's too powerful and painful. But the same smoker might, because the problem of regress always comes here. If I understood well, Hegel fixes the level of becoming one with your own, the idea of one. Frankfurt uses the idea of wholeness, I think. So one, you have to just make up your mind by creating your own, to make a decision.